Thank you for joining us. I know this is a strange time to be having a meeting. I want to invite Dina to provide a brief introduction.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. I just wanted to say welcome to everybody to the second steering committee meeting of the Comprehensive Plan Update and the Affordable Housing Study. And in this world of extreme isolation at the moment, it's remarkable that so many people, 37 people, are able to come together to share ideas and to have a dialogue about the comp plan update and the status of the housing study. We wanted to welcome several new faces to the table. As Jenny has indicated, we think that the new people are bringing an important voice to this dialogue that wasn't there originally in our first meeting, and we are so glad that you're here and we welcome you to the process. We'll be providing, as you can see from the agenda, which will be up on the screen shortly, and an overview, here we go, an overview of the engagement process and what we have been doing for the last several months, who we have been speaking to, how we've been working through this coronavirus period, etc. And then we want to spend the bulk of the time this evening talking about housing and really having a dialogue about housing issues, and HRNA is going to be leading that. And so everybody will have an opportunity to speak up. We hope you take advantage of that. We have 2 hours. And if you haven't had a chance to say what you want to say, we will be doing follow-up after the steering committee meeting. And so you'll have another opportunity to have input, whether you didn't get a chance to say it today or you're thinking of something in reflection to what was discussed. So with that, Jenny, should I turn it to you?
Sure.
Great.
So we, well, I guess before I get into the meeting and whatnot, I wanted to see, would Missy or Alex, would either of you like to provide any updates about sort of how you are running things at the city? Is there any important information that you think we need to pass along?
I think Alex was going to be our spokesperson. You still there, Alex?
Oh yeah, it looks like he has perhaps disappeared.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll go ahead and start, and if he comes back, then I'll go ahead and turn the time over to him. We have been making things function in this strange world that we're in. Our department has a lot of different functions in it. We have our field crews still out in the field doing work and doing inspections. We have methods to take in permits, as well as keep plans that are currently under review, keep those going. The big thing we're on hold with right now is items that would have to go to committees or commissions at this point in time, because council has put all of those meetings on hold for the time being. So we are functioning with a lot of our items. We actually are on Thursday at 4 o'clock. We'll be on the Cville 360, for those of you who have heard of that or not heard of that. It's a new program that the city communications office is holding twice a week in order to give different information out to the city and viewers. And today's program was at 11, and it's online if you wanted to look at it later. Is emergency responders we're speaking, so there's some good information there. And then we will be speaking on how we're continuing with development issues in this time on Thursday at 4. So we keep working and keep getting things done. And a lot of inquiries. We have people, a couple people in the office, and then we have a lot of people who are working from home. But a lot of the functions we can continue to make happen, and we're grateful that folks were willing to come on and meet today, so that we could talk about where we are with this process, and hopefully be able to move a few steps in a forward direction in a very strange world.
Great. Thanks, Missy. Before we move forward, I just want to see, can Joy and Audrey hear me? I think you may be muted if you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, good. Hey, Joy. Let's see, looks like Audrey, maybe her video may be frozen. Let's see. Josh, I'll take it on the phone as well. Well, we'll check in with Audrey as we move forward. I want to just continue on the agenda. I know 2 hours in the evening is difficult right now, so thanks again for setting aside time. As far as an update on our schedule and process, well, excuse me, to go back. As far as the process for tonight's meeting, we are planning to go through our proposed sort of changes to the engagement process for the next couple of months, get some input on that, and then talk about housing for the largest part of the meeting. So you'll see we sent along some the housing presentation you got in your email today. So if you're not viewing it on your screen, you can pull it up there. And we sent one sheet for engagement as well. But throughout this meeting, we want to make sure we're hearing from as many of you as we can. We know it's difficult in this setting. So we will be trying to stop and have discussion points where we can hear from you. There is built in to Zoom. I'm not sure how many of you have been using this software at all, but there is a hand raise function built in. You can get to that if you click on participants, it says raise hand. There's a little button. If we can see your video, you can also just literally raise your hand. And if you are calling in on the phone, you are able to raise your hand by hitting *9. And what that will do is it will pop up a little note for us that says that that you raised your hand. So we'll be, if you have a question, sort of a clarification that you're looking for, please feel free to do that. But we will try to have some specific points that we'll want to have some more discussion. But if you can, please keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. You all are doing great at that, so thank you. And we'll be trying to hear from everyone. So if we haven't heard from you in a while or at all during the meeting, we may say, any thoughts from you? But if you're not comfortable speaking up or ideas come to you later, just send me an email, send LaToya an email, we'll make sure it gets to the right person. I think we just have a brief update on where we've been, what we've done. Let's see, last time we met with you, I believe, was January. Is that right? January. And we updated you at that point sort of on our general process. We shared the overall schedule for this effort. And we got your input on sort of what had been done in the past and what you wanted to see in the future. Since we met with you last time, we met with many people, you generally in person, but some on the phone. We want to get sort of input on the same things we had asked you previously. Information about whether they, what people thought of the engagement processes that have happened so far in the city, things they would like to see in the future. And of course, especially related to housing and equity, what some of the focus areas might be. And so, housing is something we certainly want to hear more from you tonight, but we want to make sure that we've got a process moving forward in the next couple of months that we can hopefully hear from the community too. As you know, we have a big focus, our team, and I know most or all of you have a focus on making sure we're hearing from as many people as possible in the city, including people who did not come to meetings typically. And so we had planned to do a lot of smaller discussions throughout the city, sort of neighborhood-based discussions. And that's something we would still love to do, and we will do in the future, but we know there's also a need to reach out to people imminently, even under this sort of COVID situation, and share information and get input where we can, and then continue that real hefty in-person engagement process when it's possible to do so safely. And so I think with that, I will move into talking through that engagement process that we are proposing.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Brandon sent a note to let you know that that number was Jaquana Mason.
Okay.
Yep, I've got it. I just changed her in our system, so we're set. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I just didn't want you all to block her.
No, thank you
No,
for letting us know.
She's fine. I think I figured out who the person was who crashed just a few minutes ago. So I'm getting the meeting is now locked, so we should be okay.
So we'll so Jaquanda is in the meeting now?
Yes.
Okay.
She was the Galaxy phone.
Okay. Got it. All right. So we sent just this brief sort of one-page overview of our proposed engagement process for the next 2 months. It's very high level because we want to have a, just talk through it with you. We also know that having discussions right now about the future of the community is really important, but we also know that people are stretched thin with what they can do right now, how much time they have to, give to efforts that go beyond, keeping oneself and one's family healthy. So anything that we talk about tonight, we recognize might have to change in the next week again, but we're just trying to be as proactive as possible. So moving forward this month, we are working on, first of all, drafting some engagement materials. And so what that might look like is like a one-page flyer we can send out by email or possibly via mail, about this process, letting people know what we're doing, what they're going to be hearing from us in the future. And we're planning to do that at a very easy to understand, type of wording. Our goal through this whole process will be to use as little jargon as possible, especially when we're talking about things like comprehensive plans and the zoning update and whatnot. We know not everyone is super well versed in what all that is. Another thing we're working on compiling right now is some really easy to understand graphics that show existing conditions in Charlottesville related to population change, demographic change, and different levels of need and equity related to housing, transportation, access to services, and whatnot. And the reason we're drafting all of this is because we want to be able to have a sort of virtual conversation in lieu of this current, this in-person conversation that we really want to have. And I'll get back to that in a second. But as you can see here, the second thing on our list is to meet with you today. And we're continuing to also meet over video or phone with some of our key community contacts to say, what do you think are the best ways to, especially in this virtual environment, to really meaningfully engage with people, especially those communities that are marginalized in Charlottesville, people who don't normally get asked to provide input or don't normally seek ways to do that. And so I'll go over briefly what we're thinking about at a high level, but it'd be great to hear any other ideas about that. For this sort of virtual conversation series, what we're looking at is a conversation around goals and priorities for the city's future, especially as they pertain to housing and the comprehensive plan. And so we have been trying to identify some key questions that we can put out in various ways, and we will get to that shortly. But those questions that we're thinking about right now are things like, what do you think are the top 3 most important priorities when it comes to the future of the city of Charlottesville? Potentially targeting that question, like, what are your priorities related to housing affordability? What do you think a focus on equity should mean for the city? We want to make sure that not only that we're getting input, that people know that we're focusing on these issues, and that we want to try to establish what these things mean for the city, and not just come out and say, here's what we're saying affordability is, or here's what we're saying equity means. We want to make sure it's sort of a community-based vision for that. But we also, at the same time, want to make sure we're learning what people really love about Charlottesville, in addition to what sort of concerns them at the moment. And so, related to their top priorities, we're trying to find ways to ask people, what do they love about the direction the city is taking, and what concerns them. And those are sort of right now the couple of questions we've been thinking about. And we've been trying to strategize the best way to reach out to people with those questions. We know email is one way. The NDS already has an email list we can use, and we know that all of you and a lot of the people we've been talking to, other community leaders, have email lists that reach even more people. And so we're hoping for anything that we send out to have sort of a snowball effect, that it'll be sent out through different organizations to people who really need to know that this is going on and that they can provide input and that we want their input. We'll also be doing some targeted invitations to elected officials, nonprofits, all the neighborhood groups, making sure that there's information that's easy to disseminate out to their members or constituencies. As I said, we're working on drafting and finalizing some materials that we can update on the city website. And one of those things might be, a survey, potentially with some sort of incentive to try to encourage people to take time to do the survey. But we also know that a survey can be really time intensive. Not everyone has time to sit down and do a longer survey. So we've been thinking about ways to maybe do shorter polls, or other ways to get sort of a snapshot of information from people. We are also thinking about ways to do meetings, meetings like this one, phone meetings, web meetings. These might be around specific topics. That could be sort of focus groups around specific topics, housing, the environment, other topics that are related to the comprehensive plan. And this could also be webinars. So where we're sharing a lot of information. It might not be as interactive as a meeting like this, a phone meeting, but it could be a good way to provide people information so that they have that meaningful information that they can then give really meaningful input. We are also looking at social media and thinking about the best way to strategize the use of those means, probably looking at things like Twitter and even Instagram, not only to get some younger populations. We've been hearing that's a good way to get maybe some middle school, high school students to give input, but I think a lot of people are on social media, and that could really be a good way to disseminate information and make it easy for others to share with their networks. We've also heard that radio stations may be a good way to reach people, doing either something that allows people to call in, ask questions, or doing some promotional effort to let people know what we're doing and that there is an opportunity to give input. One more thing is regarding the website, the web presence for the project. We have currently got sort of a page on the city's website, and then we're working to connect to the comprehensive plan page that exists currently. But we also are working with, and that's meant to be sort of a pretty streamlined web page that right now just has a lot of background information on it. We are working on a more extensive website. I think we've finalized the group that we're going to be working with. They're based in Charlottesville, and they will be working on a more extensive but really easy to use, really clear, website with really clear language and graphics, so that we can provide background information for people, keep people updated with meeting materials that are being produced, and then also provide someplace that people know they can go when there are things like surveys posted, or if they want to submit something on an online comment form, they'll know where to go onto that website. Latoya, Dina, anyone, am I missing any of our key ideas that we're looking at this month?
Hi, this is Joy.
Mm-hmm.
Since we have some new people on, including myself, could you tell us, I see what you have here that you all talk about,
Mm-hmm.
but what is the charge for this committee?
Sure, I'm happy to go through that. Let me see if I have something I can pull up here that might help with that discussion. I don't have it ready to go, but yeah, that's a great question, and I'm happy to also, meet with those of you who are new to this process separately to give more detail about this. But in general, the steering committee is sort of an advisory group for this process. We'll be coming to you, I think, about the original idea was every 2 to 3 months. I think up front, we may be looking at potentially every 6 weeks for a couple of months here. But we'll be coming to you to share information and get input on specific topics. So example of tonight, we're sharing this engagement strategy, and we are also focusing on housing and our housing analysis that we'll be doing. We're not looking at this group as a decision-making body necessarily, but we are looking for you to give input and recommendations that will go to Planning Commission, City Council as they're working on this, and that they will inform our staff process, or the consultant team and the staff in this process. When I say this process, what I mean is a sort of 3 elements that we're working on, which is the affordable housing strategy, the comprehensive plan update, and then once that is finalized, the zoning update. And so the original schedule was that the housing strategy would be completed in November of this year. We're working on the comprehensive plan updates through this year as well into early next year. And then once the comprehensive plan is finalized, we would be working on refining the zoning to be updated to match both what's in the comprehensive plan as well as be in compliance with sort of regulations that are at the state level. So
Was the last one zoning?
yes.
Thank you.
And so I know that's a very high-level overview, but I'm happy to speak with you, Joy, or others moving forward on that to give more detail.
Jenny, can I just add really quickly to that as well, just from the engagement standpoint? We're also looking to the steering committee because there are obviously a large number of you representing different walks of life in Charlottesville. So we're looking to the steering committee also as a bit of a doorway to the different segments of Charlottesville's population as we begin our efforts. I say on the ground is very virtual right now, and for the immediate future while we're still navigating this pandemic. But the goal is that we are trying to work with existing networks that already exist in Charlottesville as a way to bring people into the process and encourage people to get information and share information and ideas through this process. So all of you are parts of those existing networks that we want to be able to connect with through this process.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Tim asked if you could ask a question. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, a follow-up about the engagement process. I feel I have high confidence in this engagement process being different and moving the needle in terms of being inclusive and meaningful. But obviously with COVID-19, that's a little bit of a challenge. I still feel confident that you all will adjust. But one of the stumbling blocks that I have, even just talking about this with friends and neighbors, is what you just described, Jenny. You know, we're looking at like a multifaceted public planning process with plan, affordable housing strategy, and a zoning ordinance update. If this needs to be tabled to a different meeting, that's okay. But I just want to raise the issue of, I'll say, branding or naming or identity, because it just seems like a mouthful. And I'm a certified planner, and it still feels like a stumbling block with all of the elements and the jargon to it. So just wanted to raise that. If we don't get to it tonight, I think that's fine. But feels really important.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking that. And I saw the email you sent, which I appreciated.
Sure.
Our original idea, which I think we discussed at the last meeting, was, you know, we agree with you completely. We cannot keep calling it the comp plan, housing strategy, zoning update. As you know, even though that's sort of informative, but not everyone knows what that all means. So our original plan was to have a engagement process with the community in March and April, and from that we would get ideas for what it should be called, because we thought we could use that as an educational process to make sure people at least start to understand what this process is, and then also saying, you know, based on that, what are some things that come to mind with what you think about the future of Charlottesville? And then we could use that to feed, I will call it a brand as well, the branding or the naming of the process. But we've, we have been starting to think about ways to move forward on that in a different way, since we're not getting that community interaction right now. We hope we will start it up in a few weeks here. But you know, we've still been thinking about ways to get that, and I think we should probably not talk, have a brainstorm on the call tonight about the naming, but I do think that's something we should talk about in some way, and we can think about that, whether that's, that could be one of the surveys we put out to get ideas, or we could have a social media campaign around getting ideas. Or we could have a small group that meets either from the steering committee or otherwise to sort of brainstorm ideas. So we'll be thinking about that in the next week or so. And I can certainly let you all know how we're moving forward, or how we think we want to move forward with that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. I want to make sure we get onto housing pretty quick here, but I do want to ask, and I know what I said about our engagement process and how we're thinking about talking to the community. That was really quick and at a high level, not much detail. But I'm curious to ask, if there's anything that I outlined that you think we need to reconsider, or we've obviously recognized there are barriers to what we can do right now, especially given the limitation on in-person contact. But if if there's other ways you think we can better or additionally address those limitations, we'd love to hear. So I see Annie, you'd like to make a comment?
Yeah, thank you. Just regarding community engagement, so the priority, of course, of the organization I represent, the Low Income Housing Coalition, is those individuals who are the lowest income, most marginalized, and therefore with the least access to technology, and probably least access to, well, the least amount of time to spend on this. So I just want to make sure as we move forward with some of these strategies, obviously social media and email and whatnot and phone calls are important and absolutely critical, but just ensuring that as much can be as mobile friendly as possible and as like easy to use as possible and like quick and digestible, so that we can like gather as many voices that maybe can't sit down in front of a computer for a long survey, but could maybe go back to their cell phones multiple times to take multiple surveys or, record video or voice memos, whatever that is, but just really ensuring that we're prioritizing those voices. I would really like to see that moving forward. So thank you.
I think we're certainly thinking about that. I think that's a good idea to think about the recording a little memo. I think more people use that functionality than I realized or than I do. But yeah, we can certainly keep thinking about ways to do that, and we'll take those ones you gave us tonight and use those. But if you think of any others too, sort of specific, ways that we can be reaching people, that's great to know. We're certainly trying to keep things very succinct and easy to understand when we're reaching out.
And Jenny, I'll just put out there really quickly, there's also, we've used it a lot in DC. There's the texting, like text survey options as well that might be very user-friendly, where it's like an SMS subscription type thing, and we can actually do a 2 or 3 question based survey that folks can just respond to by text. So there's a good number of tools to help support non-computer based engagement.
Yep. Sheila, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, similar. That helps immigrants and the Latino Hispanic community, especially if things are more written and stuff. I want to make sure that we're keeping in mind language accessibility. And I know we've talked about the huge refugee population, but particularly for Spanish speakers and the undocumented community.
Yeah, that is something we're certainly keeping in mind, and anything that's printed and engagement materials we'll be looking to be translating or getting translated. We've been talking with our web developer about how we can best make the website easy to access, and we know there are sort of Google Translate things that are built in. They're not perfect, but it gives us a better breadth of translation than trying to translate for every potential language that's out there. We want to make sure everyone has access to it. So thank you for bringing that up. I want to move on to housing if we can, but are there any final comments?
We've got one more. Joy has her hand raised.
Oh, great. Go ahead.
Joy, you're unmuted.
Now. So the other thing, can you hear me?
Yep.
So the other thing that I think is important is that you are hiring people from the neighborhood, especially the neighborhood that Annie spoke about, to be able to do some of those surveys in their neighborhoods, but also get in some kind of stipend or whatever.
Yeah, so that is something we're planning on having. We're calling them peer engagers right now. We're planning to work with people as we move forward. We would have done that already, but since we're not able to do the in-person sort of contact right now, we put that on hold for a second. But that is something we've incorporated into this process, and they will be paid. Okay, great. I'm going to keep us moving along to housing, but just like I said, don't be shy about sending an email, or you can send a chat on Zoom tonight if you think of any other ideas as we go along here. But otherwise, I will pass it off to Sarah and Phil.
All right. Thank you, Jenny. So, I'm Phil Cash. I'm partner in HR&A Advisors. Sarah, Mary, and I are going to go through a presentation. In any other circumstances, this would be an in-person conversation. So I won't be able to see, I can only see a very small number of you. If you give me visual cues about where you want me to stop or what you want me to, get into, or rolling of the eyes or nodding the heads of agreement. So I ask you to verbalize more than you might normally, because usually as we're doing these presentations, I can see how folks are reacting and we can get into conversation here. The intent is this is not really a presentation, much more of this is a conversation and a dialogue. And I have done this many, many times, but I have never done this on a web-based platform. So please forgive me if I speak too quickly or don't give you a chance to cut in.
And
So
I just want to note, sorry, as a reminder, we are recording this and we'll make sure it's available, but you do have the presentation too in your email. So if you want to pull that up separately, you certainly can. Sorry, go ahead.
Sarah, can we go to the next slide? So we're great. So those of you who don't know who HRNA is, HRNA Advisors, we're a real estate and economic development consulting firm. We have offices in New York, DC, Raleigh, Dallas, some folks in Atlanta, some folks in LA. There's about 120 of us. All of our work is really focused on the urban environment and the intersection of public and private interests. So we work on a broad range of issues, everything from helping local governments who are trying to get Amazon HQ2 to locate to their city, to working with mayors in Puerto Rico, post-hurricane, build capacity and new disaster recovery efforts. We work on a pretty broad range of issues, but the thing in common there is it's always the intersection of public and private interests. It's where the public sector is trying to get the private sector to do something, in this case, in the housing market, or the other times we work for the private sector and they're trying to get the public sector to do something. We're trying to help them either create more public benefit or explain the public benefit we do. And we think that makes us better at developing policies and programs because we understand both sides. We're kind of a bridge between the two. Next slide, please. I lead our affordable housing practice. We do work at kind of three areas. We do housing strategies and plans, which is what we're going to be talking about today. We do policies and programs. So this is things like designing inclusionary zoning policies, setting up revolving loan funds, doing public land disposition, almost anything you might recommend in a housing plan, we work on actually implementing it. Sometimes that comes out of our housing plans. Other times a community decides it's going to enact a inclusionary zoning policy, or a council member comes back from a trip to Denver and says, I want to do what Denver's doing, let's do that here. And we also do transactions. Most of our transaction work is really with public housing authorities and trying to redevelop public housing sites in a way that preserves all of the affordability. So, build first and right to return, but also better incorporates them into the neighborhood. So if you're doing just a public housing redevelopment, so something like a RAD deal or a more traditional affordable housing project, you probably wouldn't hire us. But if you're doing a larger project and you want that project to really change both the site, but also the neighborhood, we get involved in that. We like to make the argument that working at all three levels, strategies, programs, policies, and transactions, we're better at what we do because we have practical experience with the consequences of our recommendations. So when we've worked with poorly designed inclusionary zoning policies, we've worked with poorly designed revolving fund, we have experience on this, and we think that makes us better at what we do. It at least makes us a little more humble. So in terms of, this is the first conversation we're really having on housing issues. What you're seeing on the screen right now is the conversation we believe we're going to have. A big emphasis on the conversation we believe we're going to have for two reasons. One, we're in a very unique situation, the biggest public health crisis in 100 years and the largest economic contraction in, that I'm aware of, the largest economic contraction that I'm aware of. So that changes things. The reality is also that whenever you're talking about housing with the community, the direction of these conversations tend to change. And we are going to be respectful and responsive to pushback and needs to have conversations more than one time or different settings or go into topics as needed. This is how we think we'll have it, but we recognize we'll have to adjust. So today we're talking about housing issues, and that's really what are the challenges, and I'll get into more detail in the following slides. Our next conversation, we'd like to be able to talk a little bit more about housing tools. So what things might you actually start to do to address the housing issues you have? Then we actually get the goal setting. So that's, we're going to cut our housing cost burden rate in half, or we're going to end homelessness, or we're going to make sure no residents are displaced from these neighborhoods. So actually starting like, what is the quantifiable, measurable outcome that we're trying to get to? Then we're going to get into a conversation on more on the implementation side of that. How would you actually do that? Who would you, like, who's responsible? So we've already talked about the tools, but who's responsible for actually implementing those tools? Where do we have capacity? Where do we have to build it? And then we actually get into launch it. We describe this as a linear conversation. The reality is it's iterative and things circle back. The door isn't going to be closed on housing issues and identifying housing issues after this conversation. There'll be opportunity throughout the process to bring that up. There's another point that people in Charlottesville have been very clear with us, and we want to make sure we're clear that we heard, which is we do not have to finish the plan before we start to solve the problem. So if there are solutions or tools that we identify that you all want to move forward, we are happy to work in parallel on figuring out the implementation, setting goals in the implementation for particular tools. We recognize that we don't want to get in the way of actually solving this. I think that will likely prove to be particularly important in the COVID situation. Everything we're talking about will be in a slightly different light because your housing challenges are going to get much more extreme as your economic challenges get much more extreme. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk through the housing issues that impact Charlottesville. What we want to do is start to prioritize those issues. What's most important from the community? When I say prioritize, there's a couple things I want to acknowledge there. Is one, you all do not have to agree on the priorities. There may be legitimate different opinions. Also, we don't have to make a final decision on any prioritization today. We're going to, one, be available for different additional conversations, and two, send you a survey that lets you actually gives us some written comments. We'll also be available to have some one-on-one conversations. We want to talk about prioritization because affordable housing is a big concept and we want to be clear about what we're getting into. And then we're also going to identify other areas of research. So what we're presenting to you today are the issues and some data on them, but there's a lot of additional data and analysis we can do. And we're happy to do that, but we don't want to do the analysis for the sake of analysis. We want to have a conversation with you about what analysis is useful to understand the problem or what analysis is needed to help convey and discuss the problem with the broader public or key stakeholders. So as we're presenting things, as you see things that we're not getting into on the data, that you want us to, you think there's a good reason we should cut the data that way or look at it, like we want to hear that feedback. It's probably not because we haven't thought of it, although sometimes maybe. It's just that we didn't want to give you a 200 slide deck where we talk about everything. That's not actually helpful. I also want to acknowledge one other thing is the limitation of what way we have to do this right now is it is what we're presenting to you is extremely data heavy. Because our intent had been to have more interviews at this point, but we haven't had as many. And data is great, but it only tells one facet of the story. Data can tell you something's not a problem in a community, can tell you that it is, and you should always listen to the community when they say that. So we acknowledge that and try and, like, you'll see things up here that say certain issues don't appear to be problems for Charlottesville. We haven't assumed that that's true. Part of the conversation today is to ask that question. Does that make sense generally? Any quick questions or comments on that before I keep going? I can't see your faces. I'm going to assume that everything's good to keep going. Next slide. So housing affordability is a complicated issue that encompasses a lot of different issues. And so whenever, I said this to some of you before, whenever we start a project and someone says they want us to do an affordable housing plan, we spend a lot of time trying to understand what they mean by that. And these issues are not easily separated from each other. They're overlapping, they're connecting. We actually can't produce a clear diagram about what all of them are and how they relate to each other because they are so complicated and overlapping. But we do want to start to, as much as possible, get into what these issues are for Charlottesville. Next slide, please. So we took a pass at identifying a little over 10 issues, maybe right about 10 issues, that either come up in our data or have come up already in conversations. And we want to talk about some of those today. We also want you to tell us during this conversation or afterwards where we missed an issue. So I'm going to pause here. I'm sure everyone did their homework and has no other things going on in their life right now and has read all of these. I'm going to give you guys a chance to look at this for a second, and then I think we can actually start to ask. I can go through these issues one by one, but I think it's generally better to go to where people see more of an issue. So I think we can start to ask which issues folks see as top tier, and you might identify multiple issues as top tier. And again, this doesn't lock you into anything long term, but it's more about where we should start our conversation today. Sarah, do I get that right? Are they going to get a question? I don't
Yeah,
know.
we can actually pull up a poll right now, and if everybody, this is not a definitive decision-making tool. This is just a kind of a quick survey to see where we should maybe spend our time today. As Philip said, we're going to send out a more detailed survey after this meeting, but we can pull up, Josh, can we pull up that poll now, and we can, if everybody can sort of select maybe the 2 or 3 issues that you're most interested in talking about today, that will help us to sort of prioritize where we spend our time during this presentation.
And Sarah, can you just run down the list of the items,
Absolutely.
just so the folks who are not viewing their screen can know what the items are?
Yeah. So we have rental affordability, which is really about, regardless of income level, can people afford to pay their rent? Housing supply, which is really, is there enough housing to match the demand in the market? Housing stability, which is about whether households are able to stay in their homes if they want to stay in their homes. Gentrification, which really takes housing stability to the neighborhood level and asks if people are being displaced from their communities. We have home ownership, which is about whether households face barriers to building assets through home ownership. If a household wants to be an owner household, do they have opportunity to do that? Housing quality is about the quality of the structures. Are they safe? Are they free of hazardous materials or structural issues? Access to opportunity is about, excuse me, about the amenities and opportunities in a neighborhood. So that's really about thinking about concentrations of poverty and whether people in poverty have access to employment, to quality schools, and to other amenities. We have racial equity, which is about whether race plays a role in all of these other housing issues. Aging in place, are older populations able to safely and affordably remain in their homes or their communities? And supportive housing, which is about the needs of vulnerable populations.
I've got a question, please. Is this a generic list of issues that plague most communities, or has this list been developed by your assessment of Charlottesville?
This list is from Charlottesville, so we do not use the same issues everywhere. Some of these items, our impression is they're not as much of an issue, but we're hesitant to just strike them. So like when we do this in Detroit, it's a different conversation. It's not, you know, there's a couple items. Housing quality is expanded actually into multiple. That's actually expanded out into 3 or 4 different times. So when we have this conversation in Detroit, we'll talk about lead and asthma really as separate issues because that's where they're at, and that's a different level of granularity. When we did this in Atlanta, we didn't get into housing quality. We really only talked about 3 issues: access, affordability, and ownership, because that was what the feedback we got from the community about where they were at on it.
I'm asking because if you're asking me as a citizen representative for this community, how would I prioritize these issues? The list sounds important, all of them sound important, but I don't really know which are the most, other than anecdotal, I don't know which ones are actually the most pressing or need to be the most prioritized. So I'm not quite sure if I'm prepared to select my top 2 or 3 issues without understanding what are the most challenging or most pressing issues on this list.
Sure, and a big part of the conversation today and additional conversations going forward will be going into the data analysis. So we have slides on that. This is really just to get us started and hear where people are at from the get-go. But recognize that I promise I'm not trying to make you do my job for me. We will do additional analysis. Is that helpful?
Yes, I just want to understand the nature of the question. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. I'm going to jump into rental affordability, and we're going to work through the list. Yeah, I think it'll be I think that'll work. So let's talk about rental affordability. So we frame each slide as with an overall statement of why this issue matters. I think many of you here are here because you're already very aware of why these issues matter. So I apologize if I'm stating the obvious to you, but I think it's usually helpful to just state why it matters. And then the next slide we're going to get into is going to talk a little bit about what we're starting to see from Charlottesville. So rental affordability. I mean, really what it comes down to rental affordability is nationwide incomes, and affordability has two pieces: what a household can afford to pay and what it actually costs. So there's income side to it and there's cost side. And those two have been diverging in our country for a heavy divergence since the foreclosure crisis, and really incomes for households without college degrees haven't risen when you adjust for inflation in my lifetime. And I'm getting older at this point, so it's been a little bit. And so what happens with affordability issues really is that households have to cut costs everywhere else. So less has been a Joint Center for Housing Studies has some great analysis on how much less money goes into people's children. All the, there's a headline here about how it makes, actually leads to public health issues. Obviously there's a link to homelessness. There's a lot of negative implications that come out of housing affordability or rental affordability. Next slide. When we start to look at Charlottesville, we start to see, okay, well, what can be afforded? And we see at least a little bit of two stories here. One, the primary story is the median renter household can't afford median gross rent. So there's just a gap there. But you see your median renter household's incomes and ability to afford rent is rising, but that's not necessarily a reflection of people being off in better economic circumstances. That's a reflection potentially, it's hard for us to distinguish completely, of your population, your renter population shifting. So if you actually start to look at, okay, median household income and ability to afford rent for just GED or less, you don't see that rise that you start to see with median renter household incomes. So incomes are rising faster than rents for the median household, but they can't afford them, but they're not rising in the same way for households with lower education levels or just lower economic opportunity. Next slide. Also, as we start to see the data, we can see that, okay, you have cost burden. Cost burden means a household spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs. That's above the standard set by HUD, the federal government. Extremely cost burden means households are spending more than 50% of their income on housing. We care and are concerned about both. We're particularly concerned about extremely cost burden. Imagine spending more than half of your income on housing. I mean, some of you don't have to imagine. That leaves you in a very, very financially vulnerable position. When you look at the data in Charlottesville, and this is similar to other communities, that's heavily concentrated at your lowest income levels. Almost all of your extremely cost burden households are households under 35K, and the vast majority are under 20K. And that really gets to the income side of the conversation. Is housing costs, move up and down some based on quality, but there's a floor about how low housing costs get to, and lower income households just don't have the incomes to cover that. Can we go back? So this is what we put together at the highest level on rental affordability. I can move over to actually housing supply, the next issue, but want to pause if anybody wants to talk about rental affordability for a minute from the perspective of Charlottesville or other issues they see coming on here. Okay, this graph on rental affordability is absolutely absurd. Okay, would love, I can't see the eye roll, but I can hear the comment. Can we demute you so I can talk about why it's absurd?
Hi, sure, yeah. This is Chantel speaking. I don't think it needs a lot of words behind it. I mean, clearly there is an inequity that's being demonstrated on this graph. I know that there are other people on this call that live this day in and day out. And so, I guess I technically am a part of this graph as well. So yeah, it's absurd. We need to do better. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about it. I'm one of those people who's just like, just fix it. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Totally, I just want to make sure when you said absurd that I hadn't grossly missed a point or that I was understating the
No,
comment.
we're
If
all,
anything,
no,
I'm
no, no.
concerned that this is understating.
Yeah, we're on the same page here. Not,
Okay. All right, let's talk about housing supply next. So housing supply is a little bit different. It's related to housing affordability, but it's a larger, more underlying issue. Like an insufficient supply of housing leads to competition for existing housing. That's usually competition between newer residents or wealthier residents and existing residents. And we live in a, you know, a free market housing market. For the most part, it's a deregulated housing market in our country. And that means that those with more income win for housing. They're able, you know, there's basically a bidding process through rent and they lose out in housing. So as, you know, as higher income households, if there's insufficient housing supply to meet the needs of higher income households, they end up displacing or bidding up rent for lower income households. So this is part of how you end up with a housing affordability challenge. So there's, I quoted some folks, there's basically a supply side argument that you need to make sure that you're building enough housing to accommodate growth. So this doesn't happen. Next slide. So, you know, there's lots of ways we can cut this data, but to give you an idea, Charlottesville added 11,000 jobs between 2010 and 2019, but only about 2,600 housing units. Now, some of these housing units are getting added in the region, but there definitely seems to be a job versus housing imbalance. California, this is the issue that is driving a huge portion of the housing challenge in California. Certainly Charlottesville is not as dire as California, but we wouldn't want to get there. They're short over the last decade about 3 million housing units based on the number of jobs they created. Now, you can't just do simple arithmetic here and say 11,000 minus 2,600 because sometimes multiple households, you know, you have multiple wage earners in one household. So it's more complicated than that, but this does start to point to an imbalance. And part of the reason why that's so important for somewhere like Charlottesville is subsidized housing is a big part of the solution, but also there's a lot of housing that's affordable that's not subsidized. That's called naturally occurring affordable housing industry. I don't love that term because I think there's nothing naturally occurring about our market. It's not natural, it's a market. Yeah, it's not naturally occurring, it's a market, but a lot of your affordable housing is coming from market rate housing. It's just lower price. But as you have this imbalance, there's gonna be more pressure on that. So actually you have almost twice as many units that are naturally occurring than you do have subsidized units. And these numbers are approximate in Charlottesville. I mean, not quite twice as much, but close to it. So to give you that housing stock is really important, and the supply pressure on it is really important, is a really big part of what's driving your affordability challenges, or that's what it looks like from the outside. Part of this is your zoning. Charlotte's, you know, there's lots of measures for zoning and ability to develop. But if you look at your land, you know, the vast majority of developable space is single family and already built out. There's not much land that's actually available for multifamily, higher density, or what's called missing middle. So housing that's, you know, maybe not a high-rise garden style apartment, but, you know, 2, 3, 4 unit and development. So you start to have a real limit on where new housing can be added and how it can be added in your market. This is a more complicated issue than we got into in greater detail.
We had a question. We had a question on the chat. Somebody had asked, what would a more healthy balance look like? I'm assuming that's about jobs to housing units as opposed to about single family to multifamily, but I'm not sure there.
So, I mean, I'm gonna assume that's what it is. If we need to, what we don't have in here, we can throw in is what the housing units that were created in the county as well. You'd basically want a ratio that was pretty much equal if you controlled for household size. So let's say your average household size is 2.1 and the average household has 1.8 wage earners, then you'd want the ratio to be about 1.8 times more jobs than you had households. So this ratio, unless you have, I mean, I know you have some group housing, but unless you have a lot of folks with roommates, a huge portion of your development is roommates, this indicates an undersupply. It's hard to say exactly where right should be, but this indicates an undersupply.
I think Michael Payne had a question.
Yeah, one comment and one question. you know, I definitely understand and support the supply side part of it. You know, I've taken hits for supporting the supply side part of it, but I think one of the difficulties is, at least my understanding is, even with the supply issue, that's never going to filter down to those people at $25,000 a year or less. And that's, I think, one of the challenges and an important part. The question is, do you know if there's any definitive research or research that indicates whether building new housing units brings people into the city who otherwise wouldn't live there? My understanding is that building office space does that, but new housing units doesn't. But I'm not aware if there's any definitive research on that area.
Sure. So two parts. So one, I think Michael brings up a really important point, and we don't say it in writing, but I want to acknowledge it and agree with it. Housing supply solutions can help affordability challenges, but going back to where we're seeing the greatest gap, they don't solve your lowest income problem. So your household under 35,000, they don't solve the extremely cost burden problem, because that's a problem that comes, partially it's about housing cost, but mainly it's an income problem. And so solutions there are going to need to be solutions that look at, you know, rental assistance, things that help out on the income side, you know. So I think Michael brings up a very bad point. It's like, you can't, Houston's a great example. Houston has very limited zoning requirements and can build huge amounts of housing. They still have a massive affordability problem because of poverty and really low wages and massive inequality. So just supply is not a solution, and definitely don't want to come across that way. In terms of the second question, at least as I heard it, induced demand, I've seen a couple studies that give mixed answers on this. I've seen more studies that are interesting on is the supply and new development doesn't necessarily lead to displacement if a city's building enough. But if all the development is focused into only a couple parts of town, it can really, new development and the supply side solution can lead to displacing existing residents, which I'm sure most people find pretty common sense, but it's worth stating.
We had a couple comments on the chat, including one about even the land that is zoned for higher density because of other details about the way it's zoned. It frequently doesn't make sense to develop much multifamily density there. And another comment from Tim saying it would be interesting to see kind of how the new housing development has played out in Albemarle County. So we're recording those comments and thank people for sharing them.
And I think one is like, acknowledging that just multifamily zoning here is just a proxy. There's a one, developable land is an issue in Charlottesville, and then there are a number of other potential barriers to development approval and the approval process. So, you know, it's not necessarily by right. There's conditional approvals for development, which limits what can get built. All right, next slide. Okay, housing stability. So this is about displacement, and primarily displacement at the household level. So this can happen because rising rents, evictions, foreclosures. This, this is a particularly difficult issue because it damages house. Like the research on this is quite clear. It damages households severely. It damages people severely. So it harms adult employment ability. There's plenty of studies that show the impact on children in terms of educational outcomes, health outcomes. There's a lot of information here, and housing stability, I think, a pretty common sense approach is it has the ability to stay in your home and not be forced out of your home has a real impact on people's lives. I don't think that's shocking. Next slide. When we looked at Charlottesville, we didn't see a lot of displacement in the data. So, your eviction rates are relatively low. Still, any eviction's a problem, relatively low. And we saw folks generally were not moving so much. Where we did see the movement, though, was the households under 35,000. So the same households that are struggling to make rent are where almost all of the movement activity is happening in Charlottesville. Now, we had to be careful with this data because pulling out students is tough. So there's definitely some noise in these numbers, and numbers don't capture the full story. But it's not clear to us from looking at the data what the scale of your housing stability needs are in Charlottesville. I'm interested in how, this is one where the data doesn't give us a clear message, and interested in what people are seeing and experiencing, those of you who are from Charlottesville. No questions, huh?
I would say that Sheila and I work at a church and do financials. We wear a lot of hats. But I would say that in my experience, people are not moving because there's also nowhere else to move. I mean, like, sure, I have a parishioner who's paying like 80% of her income for rent, but there's nowhere she can get that would be any cheaper, so she stays, and she's not being pushed out, but also is still not a healthy situation. So I'm inclined to agree with your assessment that I have not seen as much shifting in stability, just the uncertainty remains because of other factors.
Joy, I think you're raising your hand and want to talk. You're unmuted, so we can hear you.
So with this, I have a lot of problem with a lot of things that you have just said, but I'm just gathering my thoughts. But on this, in our community, we see the displacement. We have watched the displacement. It's like we can go to, and there are new buildings where rental unit. I don't know why that's been captured, but if you can look at the 10th and Page neighborhood, if you can look at the Fifield neighborhood, you know, look at the Belmont neighborhood. Belmont neighborhood was a poor neighborhood, and if you look at what's there now, you know, if you look at Fifield, so I'm surprised that they couldn't cap this. Where, however you did your survey, it could not capture the displacement, and it should be able to catch the displacement, because a lot of African American poor people has been pushed out of this neighborhood, because if you look at 10th and Page, all of that was rentals. It's mostly home ownership in there now and a few rentals, right? And every day you have, you know, I think the only person in our neighborhoods, some of our neighborhoods, when I say neighborhoods, I am connected to quite a few neighborhoods who is keeping those units or rental units affordable is Journey, right? Where he's renting back to people from the neighborhood. So I don't know how come, however you did your survey, it didn't catch that displacement, but it is happening every single day.
Okay. So a couple things. One, that's really helpful. Two, we'll talk about the gentrification side, and we are seeing it. And I know this is a weird thing to say. We're seeing it at the neighborhood level, but we're not seeing it at the household level, which I acknowledge is a mismatch. And I think part of what's going on
well,
here
you're not going to see it in the household level because, excuse me, that's my grandson. You're not going to see it much in the household level because people are doubling up.
Okay. That's helpful because that doesn't show in the data. The other thing I want to acknowledge is like, how people are being displaced doesn't appear to be from the data through evictions. It seems to be people are just not, either they're raising the rent on them or they're just not renewing leases. And that's, I can't see what the mechanism is, but I think that's one of the reasons why it doesn't show up and why we were asking questions on this.
So yes, when they raise the rent and people can't pay the rent, it's going to be evictions, right? So
it doesn't show up as an eviction, but it is an eviction in practice. Yeah, it is. It's an
but
eviction.
Why?
It just doesn't show up in the record that way. Yeah.
I'm just asking you though, why? I'm not a mathematician or whatever, but why? Why isn't it showing up? Because it is happening.
Yeah, so eviction only shows up if they actually file court papers to get, like, so all the
courts know how many evictions happens, right? They give possession every single day to landlords. They have a record, or they have a record of how many judgment and how many possessions they turn over. So why isn't some of that even showing up?
There are some showing. It's just not all evictions like that are a problem, but your rate isn't particularly high. And I think part of that's because a lot of this is happening outside the court.
Most There are other things, it's true, but in my neighborhood, most of the time people get evicted for non-payment of rent because they can't afford it. Or they're working 2 jobs or 3 jobs, or they skipping from job to job because they have to make ends meet. So anyway, those are just my thoughts.
No, those are helpful. Sarah, can we go, unless there are more questions, can we go to the gentrification slides? Because I think, okay, great. So gentrification is really a very similar and related issue, and we split it partially because it's a little different, but they're very closely related, and I want to acknowledge that. Gentrification occurs when there's public or private investment that leads to changes in the racial and economic composition of a neighborhood. And we look at least 2 parts of this. One is there's the actual competition for the housing, so folks being displaced on the housing side. And the other is cultural. Even in neighborhoods where you have a lot of your residents stay, and doesn't necessarily show up in my data, you have cultural changes where who the businesses are serving, the institutions, the churches turnover, frankly, how neighborhoods are policed changes. So we want to acknowledge cultural change almost never shows up in our data, but we almost always hear it when we have the conversation. And so, these are some of the issues that we started to call out on the gentrification side. Can we go to the next slide? So when we look at this, and I apologize for them, hopefully they're coming through, but we start to see where you're losing low-income population. And we know that, so, the darker areas, and these are by tract, and these do not match up exactly with the neighborhoods, and we can start to talk about how to do it, and also talk about whether we're looking at the right time frame, because we're only going back to 2010, and maybe we need to tell a longer story. But this is what we can see from 2010. And then you can see which incomes are actually starting to drop population. So under 35, and you're starting to lose some between 35 and 50, and that's a net loss. So this number almost always understates what you're actually experiencing, because you're losing residents, and then some new people are being added at this income level. So you're actually losing a fair amount. You're losing more existing residents than this implies, because some of them don't show up. This only shows the net change. So under 30, about 1,500 low-income residents under 35,000, but also some loss at the 35,000 level. So I'll stop. Joy, I think you spoke to this in some other. You may have comments, or other folks may have comments on this point. I assume that gentrification is, our data shows gentrification is a significant issue in Charlottesville. But I mean, is there other ways people are doing analysis on this? I know there's some redlining analysis that's been done. Other points that would be helpful that we'll talk about.
So we had a comment on the chat. This is from Navar, or a question rather, and he asks, is there a way to separate supply-related issues versus real estate speculation? I feel like this is tied to gentrification, but I'm not sure how to exactly phrase this. Maybe Charlottesville isn't even big enough for large numbers of speculative investments, but the Dewberry comes to mind.
So I'm gonna repeat back, at least my understanding is so to what degree is the displacement happening because someone's buying up existing properties and trying to move them off market? So basically taking existing relatively affordable homeownership property or relatively affordable rental property and moving it up market? Is that what the question is about?
That's my understanding of the question.
So we haven't, that is definitely happening. We have not cut your data to try to get at that, to what scale that's happening, but we could, potentially, we'd have to work with the city on this. We could, on the single family side, we could look at, we've done this, we did this in Detroit. We look at property values when at the time of sale. So a property sold, then whether there was building permits on that property to make improvements, and then property values when the property is sold the second time. So that's if somebody's flipping properties, we can pull, I mean, we can identify if there's data on sales records and that can be matched against permits for construction, we can map and show where that's happening and how much it's shifting the price on properties. And we've done that in other places to try to get a scale on it. For rental property, we can do that, but it's a more complicated conversation.
I'm curious if the map here matches up with people's perceptions of where gentrification is most a concern. Because I know we've seen some things where we haven't seen a specific loss of low-income population, but we have seen concerns in the community around gentrification pressures.
I live in the Martha Jefferson neighborhood, and I would say that a community concern is the gentrification of gentrification. We're going through a wave of young, affluent, I think newcomers to the community who are taking very nice, older homes and doubling and even tripling the size of them. And really driving up the, there are houses selling in our community at over $450 a square foot.
So that's helpful to understand, and that's helpful to understand, and particularly the mechanism and how it's happening. So who's the buyer? So are the folks buying those properties occupying them, or are they buying them, doing it, and then selling them, or some of both?
Occupying. We've actually had, I'm on the neighborhood board, and so I walk around and pay attention to this. And there are at this time several older homes which were lovely last year, but they're now being significantly upgraded, and in the ground pools being installed. People installing swimming pools, even. Really notching the neighborhood up a whole nother level. And so it's we have a lot of young families. It's wonderful. We have a lot of kids, but it's really hard to move into what should be a desirable, walkable, close to work neighborhood. It's really changing yearly.
Okay. That's helpful to understand. It sounds like this is one where we're going to pull a little bit more data about the different forms this is taking. So how it's impacting different parts of society in different neighborhoods. There's also, I think there was a comment earlier, and we've looked at this and haven't seen clear data about the degree lower income households are being displaced out into the county. What we saw, at least when we pulled the data, is not that they're being displaced out of the county, but they're actually being displaced from the city into the county, but actually out of the county, at least net wise, the county doesn't seem to be receiving it for the most part. So maybe we go to the next slide.
Are they being displaced to Buckingham and Louisa and Fluvanna?
It's hard for us to say exactly how far out, but we can try to do a more careful cut.
And Stanton?
And Greene County is just under construction.
Got it. So Stanton, Louisa, and Greene County. So we'll do a larger cut and try to tell you where for the region this is shifting. And that's going to raise some questions as we get to the tool side about which things are under Charlottesville's control to solve and which things are going to require regional collaboration to solve. Okay. So home ownership. Why does it matter? This is, I think this is a relatively intuitive one, but home ownership is, one, it's about stability. It's also about stability and certainty of housing prices. It's also about wealth building. And I think actually one of the things that we skipped over, and I apologize, my son joined me and made me forgetful for a minute, is on the displacement issue, but also on the housing stability issue. Housing stability didn't appear as much of an issue. That may be about to change in your community in a major way. Depending on how COVID plays out for you all, your lower income households economically, if they're not at, the number of households that are not going to be able to make rent is about to go up in an unbelievable way nationally. And the number of households who aren't going to be able to make their mortgage payment is about to go up in an unbelievable way nationally. And that's going to raise challenges about evictions and displacement. There's, for the most part, there's a stay and a stop on evictions, and largely right now. I don't know exactly what Virginia's policies are, but federally there's largely a stop. That won't last. That won't last long enough to give households time to recover economically. So the reason that's relevant on the homeownership side is homeowners are generally in a better position to try to weather something like that, whereas your renters are going to be in a much harder position. And homeowners are still going to struggle on this, but renters are going to struggle worse. So homeownership is important both because of wealth building, but it's also because of the stability. Like, household wealth in America is your home for the most part. Next slide. So really, affording the median home price in Charlottesville is a difficult. The median household has not been in a position to own a home in Charlottesville since the time period we measured, and Charlottesville is not becoming any more affordable over time. Part of the reason that hasn't become more extreme is lower interest rates, and so we expect homeownership to be homeownership seems unattainable for a significant portion of your population, and we expect that to continue. Next slide. And really, when we start to look at this is Charlottesville partially mirrors a national trend, but it's a little more extreme in that your home ownership rate for every income level under those who make more than $150,000 has dropped since the foreclosure crisis. You have not recovered from home ownership from the foreclosure crisis, and now we've just got hit by COVID. So any recovery progress you were making is over for a little bit at least. I mean, in some of these drops, particularly if you look at the 50 to 75K, and it's like some more of your middle income, moderate income, 10 percentage points. That's a huge drop in home ownership rate, given how stable home ownership is on the whole. And so these are Charlottesville definitely has experienced a real shift on who can access home ownership and who is a homeowner. This is something I don't think is surprising because most of you brought it up in different conversations we've had so far, but interested in if we're missing part of the story here, this feels off key, or just thoughts on what we're seeing on home ownership. I'm going to keep moving unless there's other questions, because I know I got 15 minutes left, and I imagine 7:30 and you have other things you want to do. Housing quality. So why does housing quality matter? Well, the quality of where you live can have huge impacts on your health and your prosperity. A lot of the work we do tends to get focused on the number of housing units and how affordable they are, but a housing unit can be affordable but not give you the quality it needs. There are two primary data points or indicators we tend to look at, and those are lead poisoning issues and asthma. Lead poisoning has to do with lead paint being in a house, and asthma basically has to do with poor ventilation and low quality housing. Those are good indicators for a larger set of housing issues. Next slide. We're having a hard time finding data that really speaks to some of the data sets we use for larger cities or other locations that tell us about some of the housing quality issues. We know a lot of your housing is older. That's not surprising given the nature of Charlottesville. But it doesn't appear that a lot of it was built in a time period when lead was in use. So it's not clear to us that how big your lead exposure issues are. We know you are having significant numbers of code enforcement issues. Some of those, just based on the geographic clustering, seem related to students. Also not surprising. So this is an area where we're not sure how big of an issue this is in your community based on the data.
There's a question here if we're separating out, looking at the proximity of industrial sources of pollution when we're talking about asthma. We have not looked at that yet. If that's an area of concern, that's something that we need to go and find.
Yeah. Are there parts of Charlottesville that we think that where there's basically environmental justice issues going on that would wouldn't be about the housing quality, but would be about that would have health impacts for residents? It looks like some travel corridors. So, okay, so traffic, that makes sense. if there are other particular spots that come up, that'd be helpful to understand, and we can get into mapping out some of the travel corridors. Any other comments before we move to the next slide? So access to opportunity. So where you live shapes your future. There's been innumerable studies on this topic. It's the South in particular tends to score poorly on this issue, but where you live changes your economic mobility. It also changes your health likelihoods. There's a really, really excellent study, but really depressing study for Atlanta that basically shows if you're born in North Atlanta, you're going to live 12 years longer than if you're born in South Atlanta. That's like the difference between the United States and Liberia. It's a pretty stark difference in life expectancy. And this is, in most parts of our country, a legacy of segregation. I mean, that's just, when you start to look at these housing quality issues and access to issues and why it shows up in certain places, this is directly comes out of that. We'll go to the next slide. So when we start to get to Charlottesville, Charlottesville is harder for us in some places to map this because it's a relatively small city. And so parsing the data at the level of granularity that makes us see the story isn't as easy as we'd like. But that's okay. A lot of things in life aren't as easy as we want them to be. A couple of things we started to look at is one is what portion of your lower income households live in census tracts that are primarily your lower income households. So more than half of your lower income households live in census tracts that are more than 30% low income. So your poverty is definitely somewhat concentrated. This is actually not higher than some cities we see. Don't pat yourself on the back. This is a problem nationally, and it's been getting worse nationally. So it's not worse, but certainly is an issue. And your affordable housing is relatively concentrated in areas of higher poverty, although again, not as bad as some places. And we're not totally confident in our data, frankly, because of the student factor in here. Students skew some of this data to some extent. So in terms of access to opportunity, this is the data we're seeing. There's lots of ways to define opportunity. So we looked at this based on school district. There's transportation and ability to access actually jobs and employment centers. I think the environmental justice and public health issue that was brought up on the previous set of slides also applies here. I guess I have two sets of questions for you all on this particular issue. One, to what degree is there an access to opportunity issue in Charlottesville, and what are the measurements or what are the drivers of that? Is that about schools? Is it about jobs? Is it about transit? Is it about open space? We can cut the data and look at it in lots of ways, but this manifests in different ways. Is this about just where sidewalks are and the quality of the infrastructure? But how does access to opportunity somewhat playing out differently in Charlottesville? I'm sure there's comments about wages. So I see the comment from Lisa about wages, and I want to address that and come back to some others. So I made this comment at the beginning about how affordability is both about incomes and the cost of housing, and most everything we're talking about is really focused on the cost side. But it's wrong. It's foolish, and we try never to be too narrow to not consider wages. And I think this is one of the questions of the advisory committee, if there are recommendations related to incomes and wages or just rental assistance, which I know something Charlottesville has already moved on, but how we want to look at some of those income side solutions. I've spent most of my career on the housing side, on the cost side, but I'll acknowledge that COVID is really forcing me to reckon with the policies and work I've done, that almost none of the housing work I've done would have been sufficient or has proven to be sufficient to protect households from this income crisis that they're getting hit with, a massive unemployment. But it's really hard to address that affordability challenge of just massive income loss with anything just address the cost side that doesn't also include the income side. So I think it'll be a question as we do this work about which tools on the income side you all want to look at. And I think that's something that as you watch our nation over the next hopefully 6 to 12 months, that as a nation we'll have to reckon with in a way we haven't, because we have not as a nation done much of anything on the income side. We haven't done much for rental vouchers. We haven't done much for minimum wage in a long time. There was also a comment about transit. The comment about transit. So are there particular transit lines or issues that we should be mapping or thinking about? Like Are there areas where you don't see affordable housing that we need to see more affordable housing in order to create better access to opportunity for transit or for other topics? I'm not seeing all the questions, so if somebody can read them out. For whatever reason, my computer won't let me see them all.
Let's see, we had a comment about the fact that there really are essentially no affordable housing options in certain neighborhoods. We had some comments about the fact that historic segregation lines really do play into this pretty substantially. The access to transit conversation, I'd like to dig into a little bit more, because I think there's, the bus lines that exist seem to connect to a lot of places, but of course there's, having a bus line and having sort of frequency of quality service. So I'm just a little bit curious what kind of issues people are seeing there and what areas of the city they'd like to see better access.
Yeah, I'll comment a little bit. It's more of the frequency. There's a number of bus lines in the municipality, but they travel at 45-minute or hour intervals, which just doesn't, and it's not always reliable. So that really affects that ability to get to and from work, and missing one bus can cause a job loss.
That's helpful to understand. There was also a statement about there's some neighborhoods with no affordable housing in them. I want to be devil's advocate for a second. Is that a problem? Is that something that we're looking to change?
I think it's a problem. I think we want to have people of different incomes dispersed throughout our community, not ghettoized into just one or two neighborhoods.
I would agree, but I always want to push communities to define it.
And if I could jump in, I think it's also a problem because there's a dynamic where in these wealthier neighborhoods, which are predominantly all R1 single family zoning, they successfully push back against new development, and we push all development into certain neighborhoods that tend to be low income historic Black neighborhoods, and then that development never comes to these wealthier white neighborhoods, and I think that produces some really bad dynamics locally.
That's still just, Mary, so something worth to look at is our ability to map or look at where developments actually happened along racial lines.
And the density of the development.
Yep.
Yeah.
I see Brandon Collins has a hand raised. Brandon, did you have a comment? Trying to unmute you now.
Okay. Yeah, I had a couple of comments. I guess going back to what Michael was saying, there's been a lot of research in Charlottesville about these patterns of racial segregation and how they match up with zoning. And I think there's a real desire in the community to see that addressed through the housing strategy. And yeah, I mean, we're basically continuing segregation, but then getting to a point where then we're starting to push people out of even traditionally Black neighborhoods. So, there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. I think what's interesting to maybe get your head around is, so say Greenbrier neighborhood, which is all pretty much R1 zoning, right? Say you were to do higher density there, bring in, more folks, more extremely low income folks, more Black folks. There's not a lot of opportunities in that neighborhood. And in fact, they're not even served by transit, right? They don't have transit access to Greenbrier. So when you're looking at sort of getting into these white neighborhoods, these wealthy neighborhoods, you really got to think about what are the opportunities and the services that would be there to help people. And I think going back to transit just a little bit, like we hear from public housing residents in almost every one of our public housing neighborhoods, there's unique transit needs. But I would look at places like Riverside, which is over where I live, which doesn't have bus service on the weekends. Public housing, and there's folks on that street too that are, you know, fairly affordable homes there. The neighborhood itself hasn't totally become gentrified just yet, but you know, transit access is poor. When we look at South First Street, where I think you see that whole neighborhood around Ridge Street and Hartman's Mill, South First Street, our public housing residents lost a bus stop, and it's become really difficult for residents there. And I imagine that affects the whole neighborhood there as well, because they're under a lot of gentrification pressure as well.
And then, you know, and they lost a bus stop, so they took a bus stop out of the neighborhood that's got gentrification.
Yeah, basically, yeah. And so you got to walk. I don't know how long that stretch, the hike is, but I know Audrey's on the call. She has to make that walk. It's just brutal for anybody. And, you know, if you've got any kind of disability or you're just tired, you know, it's just not equitable. And I think at West Haven, there's challenges with, you know, the changes they made to transit a few years back. You know, there's a lot. I think if you go to any public housing neighborhood, you're going to find unique problems with transit access. And then the last thought I was going to throw on the pile is, you know, the growth of the SIA, where we've got, you know, a commitment to preserve subsidized housing there and public housing, and maybe build some more. However, the opportunities for employment, the opportunities for health, you know, medical clinics and things like that seem to be diminishing because of the growth of the strategic investment area, and it, you know, the desire to bring in more office space and, you know, revitalize, quote, the downtown area, which is bringing in services that aren't really services for the people who live there currently. And that's another pretty big pressure that I think is really weighing on folks. That's what we hear, and that's what we've been kind of looking at for the last few years.
So even if they keep the units in that location, they basically have culturally displaced the neighborhood because the services and things won't be there anymore.
Absolutely, and you've got, you know, the whole Ix Art Park thing, which is getting a little better about how it relates to the community, but it's basically welcomed a white invasion into the community with high-end cupcake shops and, you know, just a variety of things, and not really bringing in additional good things for the people who live there. And so, you know, when we look at, if you're deconcentrating poverty, you know, there's a lot of things to look at. It's not always that you want to deconcentrate it. You know, maybe you need to bring in those services, or maybe watch what you're encouraging in terms of growth around those neighborhoods and who you're inviting in. And, you know, I think you're going to see home prices rise there. And we know there's been a loss of African Americans from that neighborhood over a number of years.
Okay, that's helpful. So,
Bill, sorry, can I interrupt real quick? Just, I know we're hitting 7:30. I think we're just going to keep going, but I know maybe not everyone can stay. I just want to reiterate a couple of things. We're recording this, so we can, you know, make a recording available to you if you need to leave, which we totally understand. We did send the presentation out as well, and we will also be reaching out with some sort of survey or other way to get your, you know, responses to any specific questions if you've not been able to give us your responses tonight, or if anything comes to you in the next week or so. So I just wanted to make sure that's clear. If you need to go, please, you know, feel free. But thank you for making time to come out tonight, or come out virtually tonight.
Yeah, really appreciate the insight and the thoughts on this. So, racial equity. I don't know. It feels a little silly to talk about why does it matter, since it's such a fundamentally important thing. But, you know, racial justice, racial equity, racial inequality underlie almost every housing data point and inequality in them that we could look at. So, income, homeownership rate, housing cost burden likelihood, almost anything you can look at. This is there. Charlottesville is not an exception to these national issues. So if you look at shift in home ownership, you know, you have an increase in white home ownership, you have a decrease in black home ownership. You have you know, a 70% difference in values between the homes owned based on, you know, related to race. Next slide. You have your homeownership rate varying dramatically across all income levels. So this isn't just about, okay, race and income overlap a lot. And sometimes it's tough to tell which something's about. Is it about race, or is it about income, or is it about both? Well, you can look at this and say, even when you start to control for income, you still have a massive difference in home ownership. Now, this is one variable. We can look at other variables. We didn't want to bury you in sheets. There's a part of this that is not, this is more than income. I think home ownership in particular, really the history of, you know, the longer history of segregation and covenants on deeds and discriminatory lending practices, and the more recent history of the foreclosure crisis, which overwhelmingly impacted the Black community because predatory mortgage products were targeted to them regardless of credit and income level. It's a particularly irrelevant place to look at, but it just represents something that's more systemic and larger. I think most of us would acknowledge that, maybe not aware of it fully, but acknowledge it. Given everything that you know, the origin of this study and the work, we assume that racial equity is, if not the central focus, a central focus in our analysis. But definitely want to hear confirmation on that, and also want to hear about some of the work that's already going on and what analysis we can be doing. We're going to think about this more, but what analysis you think we can be doing to help make people understand both how fundamental and how negative, what the consequences of this are. So I'll pause right there. It's really asking, one, for confirmation, which I believe we will receive, and two, about how that conversation is playing out in Charlottesville and where you think more information could help move that forward, or which facts do people seem to get stuck on. Income, you know, conflating income and race is one of the facts I think people get stuck on, which is why we put this slide together. It's not just income. But interested in how this conversation is playing out in Charlottesville. No comments on that? Okay. We'll keep moving.
I have a comment, but I'm not quite sure how to frame it. I work with families and
Muted. You're muted.
And so a lot of interface with the poorer side of Charlottesville. And so as I listen to these slides, and I realize the topic is housing, I think it just really stresses the issue of, within the comp plan update, the chapter on social services and the connection between the lack of or the threadbare social services that are available to those families in crisis who are not always the same as the poor people in this town, but often correlate. And so I'm not quite, again, I understand your topic is housing, but as I listen to this, I'm just, you know, wanting to add that overlay. And I guess it will happen in the actual sections of the comp plan. But clearly they're connected.
Yeah, I would say one thing we'll be looking at when we're updating the comprehensive plan is looking at, you know, what does equity mean for these different chapters, and that will include, you know, a section, you know, community facility section or whatever, wherever those sort of services are housed in the plan.
Well, it's hard to make the rent when dad's been thrown in jail because he's abusing the wife or mom, you know, the spiraling issues of social dysfunction, family dysfunction that can turn a vulnerable household into a you know, evicted household.
Other comments about how the conversation about race and housing is playing out in Charlottesville? So you made a comment that there's a need to have, like there was a comment made earlier that there's a need to have affordable housing in all parts of the city, and that part of the solution for deconcentrating poverty isn't just attracting wealthier, primarily white folks to poorer neighborhoods, which I think makes a lot of sense. How do your wealthier neighborhoods feel about that?
Feel about what?
Feel about the idea of lower income households, communities, having black neighbors. Frankly, how do they feel about? Do they acknowledge? Do people in Charlottesville acknowledge that there is a racial segregation issue? Like, to what degree is that something that's acknowledged?
I think we really need to be mindful when we tie African Americans only to low income. So let's be mindful of that. There are low income white individuals as well. So let's not speak in stereotypes and overgeneralize who we're talking about. We are talking about a vast audience. It's not, you can't just pinpoint only African Americans as being in this situation. Let's be mindful of that. Another thing I like to talk about is for racial equality is when we get to solutions, I would like for us not to continue, and I think the community wants to see this as well, especially the African American community, not just continue the same old solutions. A lot of individuals will continue to gear and always gear to more public housing. There's a large portion of the African American population and just general low income individuals that I work with every single day who want a way out and who want to stop this generational aspect of poverty. So I want us to kind of think out of the box and be mindful of not starting to narrow and stereotype our conversation. Just be mindful of that, because we have some of the individuals that we're trying to help a part of this call. And if they don't feel comfortable about speaking up, I will certainly speak up and say, hey, let's take this conversation back to where it needs to be focused on. And it's more about income versus just African Americans. So I'm starting to feel that a shift in the conversation and want us to continue to be mindful of that. I'm not asking for confirmation. This is just my perspective of where I see a little shift going.
Okay, that's helpful. That's helpful to hear. In terms of pushing for on the tool side and for solutions that we don't fall into the same old. Looking at this slide, one of the things we saw on this is one of the important ways to address not necessarily the income disparity, but the racial disparity. Will that be tools around homeownership? Because it's not the issue here. This isn't an income issue. I look at this slide, and that's part of, I don't want to conflate them because I recognize they're very separate things. This appears to be, when I look at the data, a race issue. I don't know if that feels correct of those in Charlottesville or how people feel about prioritizing homeownership or prioritizing homeownership in relation to race. But that would be a slide like this would raise a question for us about tools related to accessing homeownership, particularly with race in mind.
It is very relevant because that's how you raise people up and get them out of poverty. And I work in this industry, in the homeowner industry, and I see how individuals of color, and I mean not just African Americans, just brown people in general, how sometimes if I'm not there at the table as their advocate, I can see how the conversation would have gone another way, and how some lenders just walk in with a stereotype of how certain individuals should be treated, and they gear them to certain products. It's like, wait a minute, hold up. Why are they going to this product when their credit score says that they can get another product?
Yeah, and there's a data point that's not in here, but we should pull out national. Is like the number one predictor of getting a subprime mortgage and during the foreclosure crisis wasn't your income or your credit score, it was your race. And that unfortunately hasn't necessarily changed quite to the degree we wanted. Okay.
Charlottesville was one of the primary areas that were known to be predatory. Prior to 2010, there was a report that came out that said many of the lenders in Charlottesville didn't base whether or not you got a loan on
the normal criteria, such as your credit score, such as your income, but it was basically your race.
We saw a hand raised just a minute ago from Chantel Bingham. Chantel, did you want to make a comment?
No, thank you. I think that you guys have figured it out when you were talking. So I was just going to make a comment on linking just race and income is intrinsically linked in Charlottesville. And I do appreciate this graph kind of breaking it down by income so we can filter out that factor and just be able to look at the home ownership bands. That's already been said. I am going to have to get off the call because it is late. I do appreciate this. And I do look forward to engaging. Yeah.
And I apologize for us going so long, so I'll move to the next slide and you guys will get a chance.
I wanted to answer, sorry, you asked a question about how some of the more middle and upper income neighborhoods feel about auxiliary housing, subdividing and allowing infill. And our board actually had a conversation about that, I guess the month before we all got closed in, and had looking forward to participating in discussions on the zoning update. And I think that one thing to consider as you look at Charlottesville is in some of the neighborhoods, a lot of people in the neighborhood are not from Charlottesville or South. Most of my neighbors are university people who come from all over and bring a lot of very diverse and in fact worldly attitudes about what a neighborhood looks like. And so I think that there's probably a lot more interest and willingness in the idea of infill housing than might be expected. The biggest concern is how it's done, because we have several examples in our neighborhood where it wasn't done well. Like one, they exceeded the building height and there was a permit issue and the city let them proceed with it. So it left a bad feel for the issue. But from my conversations with neighbors and on the board, I think the concern is how it's done and that there's a lot more openness than might be expected.
Great. All right, we're going to move to the next slide, just out of respect for time.
We had a hand up from Emily.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Emily, go ahead.
Hi, I just wanted to add a technical need. Some people that have gotten disconnected, or at least one, can't get back on the call. I was wondering if you could open the waiting room.
Yeah, thanks. We've been letting people in sort of slowly if we recognize who they are. As you saw, we had a little issue at the beginning of the meeting with other people coming in and taking over the screen. But yeah, we can, Josh should be able to let them in now. Thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Great, thank you.
So aging in place, I think, this matters for, this is both an affordability challenge and just an ability to stay where you're at. So actually to have mobility to have your house actually fit your needs. Next slide. When we look at Charlottesville, you do have a significant senior population and your senior population is growing. And about a third of your seniors, those over 65 are making less than $35,000 a year. So a third of your seniors are on fixed incomes, relatively low fixed incomes. So there's both an aging in place challenge here, and it definitely overlaps to some degree with your affordability issues. So I don't know how much this issue gets flagged or brought up, but certainly the data shows that this is a challenge that people in Charlottesville are encountering. On the supportive housing, just moving a little bit quicker here. So supportive housing, for those who know, is really housing with supportive services. So I think, Diane, something to your point about the social services side, this is services that are usually tied more with the housing. So sometimes those are mental health services, sometimes those are services for veterans, sometimes those are services for chronically homeless. But a failure to provide services with the housing, so actually housing that provides supportive services, really is a failure to provide housing, because these are generally households that cannot maintain or sustain housing without those services. Next slide. when we look at Charlottesville, we see in recent data a pretty significant drop in 20. And I don't know if there's more story of the data, but it definitely seems like there, at the outside, it seems like there's an issue. It's hard to tell if the issue is actually on the downswing or the data is incomplete. From looking at the data, it looks like you still have an issue, but you've been making progress in recent years. From the outside, that's how it looks. I could be mistaken. Want to take comments here? I know I jumped through too quickly, so I'm going to mix those comments up. I'll do aging in place and supportive housing. I can't. Trying to see because I hear about. So, Carl, you hearing about aging in place? Problem at 10th and Page frequently. Okay. Okay, so I see some of the comments here. Is there anything anybody wants to just actually verbally raise their hand and discuss? We'll definitely go through the comments and respond to them. It doesn't seem like there's any that necessary.
Navarre just posted a question. Have ADUs made a significant impact on aging in place for other communities?
Portland's the quintessential example of dying ADUs the most. I don't know of any studies that show a particular impact on ADUs. I think if you let go of traditional knowledge and just look at, historic cultural practices, there's a lot of evidence that shows historically that's how aging was dealt with, and it allowed folks to age in place and have multi-generational housing. Our country is pretty different. It's changed over time. I don't know. So direct answer is no, I don't know of any studies, but we can look at it too. I think there is some common sense and historical context to look at, is that ADUs do allow that to happen, and historically that was they were called granny flats for a reason, and they were that was the most common occupant of an ADU was extended family. We're doing work in a town of Cary, North Carolina. I don't know how many are familiar with it, but they have actually a relatively significant portion of ADUs in some subdivisions. Subdivisions are primarily occupied by Southeast Asian immigrants, where there's multi-generational households are more common. And so the developers for those subdivisions actually do it from the start because they know that their customers are looking for it. I know in DC, accessory dwelling units are extremely popular, but frankly, they're popular because housing is so damn expensive. You need the rental income to be able to afford to own a house. So they can be a mixed blessing. Go to the next slide. So we're going to get into next steps and kind of wrap this up, hopefully before 8 o'clock. As been said several times, we're going to send you a survey. I think that the comments Diane made at the beginning about, okay, how do we make decisions about prioritization given that we don't have enough information? You have more information. We are going to be doing more analysis. We want to start to hear from you about not necessarily the ranking will be a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but what you think, what you see as the top tier issues. It is okay for you to tell us you think everything is a top tier issue. We're still going to make you do some prioritization later when it comes to budgeting and actual allocation of resources, but all of these things may be relatively top tier issues. I think we've covered most of the issues, but I'll be interested as you all have a chance to chew on this more, if there are issues or framings of our issues that are missing important parts of what the conversation, what's happening in Charlottesville or what needs to happen in Charlottesville. And again, particularly interested in where you think we need some additional analysis. I've flagged a couple of those topics, both analysis so we can understand this, but also analysis because we're going to take a simplified version or a different version of this and use it for some of our engagement with the broader public. And so how we're making sure the broader public understands some of the points we're trying to make. So if there's analysis or data you think that's going to be particularly useful for that, we want to hear it. We'll be sending that around next week and giving you a chance to give us feedback. Next slide. Then the next conversation we're going to start to get into is really about tools. So given the priorities that we've talked about and the issues we're facing in Charlottesville, what are some of the tools that are relevant and start to prioritize that? And then what are some of the limitations and trade-offs of those tools? There are no there are no magic bullets. There are no easy solutions in housing, affordable housing. But there are some things that you can make a real difference and make some real progress. And we're going to go through what those tools are at a higher level and have that's going to be the conversation that we get into the next call in about 6 weeks. And then go from there and really start to break into drilling into an analysis of specific tools. So I appreciate everyone sticking with me so late and paying attention through our online conversation. Hopefully this format worked. You have a copy of this, and please follow up with me, Sarah, or Mary, or Jenny, and any of us. We'll get back to you, and happy to have additional conversations. And apologize for those of you that we should have interviewed already. Our intent was to interview in person before we came, as we were coming down, and now we are shifting to a more phone-based approach. Usually we do many more interviews before we actually have a conversation like this.
Thanks, Phil. And thanks to everyone else. As I just wanted to reiterate again that we did see all the comments you've submitted on the chat, and we're keeping all of that and saving that and reviewing all of that. So even if we didn't directly address something, I just want you to know we saw that. We'll be reaching out. I'm not going to keep you much longer tonight. We'll be reaching out with a follow-up form. You have my email because you've been getting emails from me, so don't be afraid to reach out anytime. I know we had some technical issues tonight. Some people got dropped from the call and might not have been able to get back in. I'll be following up with people. We're happy to have small group discussions in the coming weeks as needed to make sure you caught everything, answer any specific questions. And like Phil said, we'll be reaching out to schedule another meeting as we keep moving forward on this as well. Yeah, thank you to our new members that joined us tonight. I'm sorry we didn't get to introduce all of you specifically, but I'm glad it looks like everyone was able to join. And I'll make sure to update the roster with you on there so everyone can see who you are and that you're participating. I do want to call out too and give a chance for anyone who's not on the steering committee to give brief comments. We want to, we're obviously trying to wrap it up. Oh, good, Joy was able to get back in, it looks like. Hi, Joy, can you hear me? All right, looks like we got Joy back. Is there anyone who's here that is not on the steering committee that want to make any brief statements before we sign off? I'm looking at the list and I don't think I see maybe anyone who's not on there. So anyone who is on the steering committee want to make any final comments?
Just come with an open mind and an open heart throughout this whole process.
That's a very good suggestion. Yes, I think we'll try to keep us focused on that throughout. But thank you all for taking time in this crazy time to meet with us, and we'll keep refining this process. I'm sure we'll have to have at least one more meeting on some digital virtual way. So we'll keep on figuring out the best way to do that, and we'll work with you to make sure you can get us your input. So thank you, everyone. And anything else final that I'm forgetting? Anyone? Latoya, Dina, wave at me. Okay, we're good. Thank you for coming. Have a good night.
Stay safe.
Yes, please stay safe.